Born in Peru, then adopted and raised in Central California, I grew up knowing about my heritage and my roots, but I didn't really know my birth country or my birth family until I visited the country when I was 12 years old. That same year, a school friend told me about a week-long marine science summer camp that she had gone to, and she thought that I would like. And now, traveling an adventurous girly, I was very interested in the idea, and thankfully, my mom signed me up. The Ocean Explorers program at UC Santa Cruz Seymour Center was my first hands-on exposure to marine research and conservation. Because of this experience, I would proclaim my intentions of becoming a marine biologist for a while, and even though I ended up in many other career paths when I was ready to go for it, the opportunity was here for me at Scripps. My birth family members in Peru did not have this experience, though, despite half of my cousins, including Kevin, being raised by the ocean in their coastal town. Kevin and I were catching up over WhatsApp, and when I told him about my grad school and career plans, he said he'd never thought he would know anyone that would become a marine biologist, let alone someone in our family. So while sitting in my classes on climate science and underwater archaeology, and even environmental economics, I would find myself thinking about how these realities were playing out in Peru, opting for assignments that would allow me to research anything about marine aspects in the country. I learned about small-scale fishing, surfing culture, the Peruvian or Humboldt Current, and the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and I was blown away by the richness of this country's coastal zone. I also learned it is the world's largest producer of guano, or the excrement from seabirds, that has recently been valued at over $1 billion annually. And also that it's home to the world's biggest fishery resource, anchoveta, with artisanal fishers, wholesalers, markets, and restaurants generating $2.4 billion a year. These extractive industries have been studied over time, with varying attempts by national bodies to better regulate the activity, given the economic motivations. But what I was really curious about was how local coastal communities were practicing marine conservation to maintain these precious resources. I had learned about a few small projects in Peru, so I reached out to them, but unfortunately they didn't have the capacity or the funding to work with me. This pushed me to take a broader look at how local conservation efforts were faring across the country's coastline. I wanted to support my birth country's marine conservation movement from the ground up and focus on smaller initiatives that may be less recognized or valued or even studied for their contributions to the sector. I looked to understand what stood in the way of keeping these frontline projects from thriving and think through some strategies that might be used to stabilize or increase their capacities. As I was looking into this, Ipsos, a Peruvian public opinion research company, and Oceana Peru, the country's arm of the largest international ocean conservation nonprofit, published their results from a survey of coastal residents' opinions about ocean issues. It showed that 91% of respondents believed that Peruvian marine resources were being overexploited, and in fact, that 98% thought Peru needed more protected areas to conserve the sea's biodiversity. So there was some evidence that the public was interested in ways to figure out a better path to sustainability. So I got to work. First, I set out to find any pre-existing research that would give me any context about the landscape of marine conservation in Peru, particularly as it pertained to funding for local projects, but unfortunately, very little to no information was readily available or formally published. Next, I needed to get more information about these local conservation projects directly. So I figured that my lack of awareness of these projects was probably due to being a foreign audience, but there was likely a lot more groups that were very well known in the communities in which they were located. So I wanted to cast a broad net and find them and map them out. Once I started growing that list of local projects, I intended to hone in on a subset of these groups. And finally, I intended to travel to Peru to meet with the leaders and participants of these groups and ask them a mix of preset questions that I could later analyze for their responses for themes to inform the strategies. In my pursuit of projects to interview, I covered quite a bit of ground. I stopped by the home of the longest and first legally protected wave in the world, called Chicama, in Puerto Malabrigo in the north. I spent time getting to know the rocky beaches of Lima in the country's capital. And then I headed south. I went down to the home of approximately half of the entire Peruvian Humboldt penguin population at Punta San Juan. Getting to experience the landscape in which these conservation leaders and communities relate to and rely on the seas was incredible. And remember that wide net that I cast? Well, using a broad definition of how marine conservation work was being carried out, including volunteer collectives, student university groups, educational social media campaigns, species-specific researchers, science training programs, and visual storytellers, I identified 87 local marine conservation initiatives in Peru, ranging from projects running for 30+ years and some that were just a few years old. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's more groups to add or even new projects that are being created right now, but this particular list of Peruvian-raised projects did not exist publicly. So to that end, I developed it into a public-facing directory that could be of use to funders looking for new projects, individual donors, volunteers, students looking for internships or places to do their theses, and even as a reference for the groups themselves. But for now, I could only talk to so many of these groups, and I ended up interviewing 23 leaders from 20 different initiatives across each of the regions that I visited. 34% of these leaders were biologists, and others had varying professions. One was a guano island ranger, another a surf instructor, and another a medical vet. For accuracy, I used recording programs and artificial intelligence transcription software to capture and process their responses to the semi-structured interviews. And this proved to be very helpful as the total amount of audio that I captured clocked in at 19 hours, 28 minutes, and 53 seconds. Using a mixed methods web application as a database, I filled it in with 472 excerpts by the interviewees, and I used a qualitative analysis approach of inductive coding to then categorize the information from this sample of people into several challenges and needs shown here. In each theme below, the numbers in the table are the amount of times that they showed up in the excerpt database, from the highest to the lowest, and I'll speak to the top 3 from each column. The most frequently discussed challenges centered on student education, collaborations with fishing communities, and of course, funding and sustainability. The education theme was broad, ranging from youth in coastal communities lacking awareness of the ecosystems in their own backyard, to the very few graduate degrees available in marine biology, there's 2, leading to bright flight or Peruvian students leaving the country and the sector completely behind. In working with fishermen, those who had gained trust with that demographic noted that there was quite a high barrier to doing so, ranging from gender discrimination. For example, one interviewee noted that fishermen had told her if she went out on their boat, she'd bring them bad luck, to difficulty in getting them to stop throwing trash into their own waters. Funding, of course, had a myriad of issues, from length of grants to the low amount actually issued, and to a lack of national sources of funding and the reluctance from locals, as well as small business, to donate. Several of the organizations were not currently running projects due to loss of funding, or they were used to working other types of jobs as their main source of income, and then were acting as volunteers at their own organization. And when it came to the needs, interviewees spoke about the importance of spending extended periods of time at the sites of research, being able to lean on the knowledge that comes from fishermen spending so much time at sea, as well as finding ways to engage and invest in the communities and families in the coastal communities where they were researching and working. Interviewees noted that they felt a bit removed from others in the sector when working in more remote areas, but also that it was important to be in the same place day in and day out in order to observe smaller changes in the ecosystem that others not frequenting the sites would not catch. And relatedly, many noted how local fishermen were also a second set of eyes on things, like how regulation enforcement was actually occurring in practice, how fish stocks were shifting, so being able to collaborate effectively with them was highly desired. Interviewees also spoke to a sense of the future of conservation, with the need to capacitate other locals on the coast more broadly so that they could stay in their home regions, retain local identity and knowledge, and strengthen their local conservation ethic on the ground. Despite these challenges and needs, the longstanding structural barriers still in place that make marine conservation very difficult in Peru, these groups have been unrelenting in their vision for the generational cultural shifts toward a stronger awareness of protecting their home seas. Many of the groups that I interviewed were already investing in capacity building programs through developed volunteer programs and internships, or they were running educational courses and training workshops for students and community members that might not otherwise have access to those types of resources from their own school or university. So the strategies for growth and amplification of their efforts that I could suggest, such as partnering with departments from socially focused universities that could help increase their communications or develop stronger materials for grant packages, or building more of an intentional professional community amongst themselves, and even aligning on a national community agenda for the ocean, really sets the onus on these groups where I think more responsibility could fall onto the international funding world, and a deeper examination of those habits of funding could be pursued. Investing in small projects can have a big return and connect the world to the frontline communities that are the sentinels of the sea, and that in turn provide a window into the global picture of our changing seas. While there is much more work to be done with and for these local organizations, I hope that this study is a step towards highlighting the importance of these small yet mighty communities. I'd like to thank my capstone advisory committee, Dr. Susana Cárdenas Analisa and Patricia Makhlouf, Emmy Cook and Catalina Lopez Agastegui, both who are also alumni of the program. I want to shout out to all the marine conservation leaders that were willing to let me interview them and were so candid with me while in Peru. And I wanted to thank all of the SIO staff and students, alumni, current cohort mates, my mentor, as well as my friends and my family, all my friends on the East Coast that are watching, thank you so much. And everyone that was able to travel from the Central Valley to be here today with me. And with that, I'll take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Hi, Analisa.
Hi.
Nice to see you in person.
Yes.
So, quick question for you. Was it surprising to see that although funding is a big challenge and is limited, to see such a diversity of projects going on with very small groups and organizations? And could you speak to that a little bit and how that may reflect all the different issues and challenges that Peru is facing in terms of marine conservation?
Sure. I definitely was surprised. I had been looking into some of the research by Peruvian scholars in some of my past classes, and there were a few groups that kept cropping up, and those are the groups that I had originally reached out to. And kind of as I noted earlier, I was like, I'm sure there's more small groups doing this work on the ground, but I definitely did not expect to find as many as I did, and I think even my capstone chair, Susana, also was like, I'm so shocked that there's this many. Where have they all been and what are they all doing? So I noticed that there definitely was also, like you mentioned, kind of a split between what everyone was focused on. And it reflected a lot of what the interviews also spoke to in the interviews, where they felt that there was very few people in very particular niches. So there wasn't like a community of people that are researching dolphins. There's maybe like one person. You know, there's only so many people that are specialized, given, again, the lack of the higher graduate degree programs that are not in the country. I was able to kind of go through a list of these different graduate degree programs, and yeah, it was pretty stunning to see there's just literally 2 for the entire country, from like a set of over 20 universities. And then I think that there is a great sense of, again, related to this issue of wanting to capacitate local people, figure out how to make more jobs for locals, not just fishermen, but also for people that are living in these coastal sites. that this career path doesn't quite go anywhere. Another interviewee had noted that, she's like, there are students that are trying to study this, and there could be people that are ready to do work on these projects, but where are they going to go? We have one institution for the ocean. It's called IMARPE. We have, only so many projects that these students can step into. So it really felt like there was these smaller problems. You could see them reflect this huge picture of, the macro issues in the country of education from the lowest level to the highest level, from people figuring out, what they were going to do for their own livelihood. And again, it was really interesting to see so many people that were just willing to volunteer. They were very willing and ready and able, very emotionally motivated, and motivated by their own culture and identity to pick up the baton and keep the work moving.